Hardin County, Iowa, 1987. The land runs flat in every direction. No hills, no cover. Just coarse and frozen ground and a sky the color of old iron pressing down on everything beneath it. In a grain shed at the edge of a farm nobody would look at twice. Something is burning, not out of control. Controlled, deliberate. A column of heat, rising from a pipe welded to a steel plate on a dirt floor, and standing in front of it, a young man with grease already under his fingernails at 7 in the morning, holding 40 pounds of molten iron in a ladle above a sand mold he carved by hand. The bank wants its answer in June. The dealer wants $400 for a part made of $3 worth of iron. And somewhere in this county, a tractor is already starting to fail. He counts to 9. He pours. Tuesday morning, March 1987. The boneyard behind Kenneth Lee's machine shop sat at the edge of the gravel lot like everything that had ever broken down and been left to figure out its own next move. Engine blocks with cracks running through them like fault lines. Axle housings rusted to the color of old blood. A grain auger with its shaft snapped clean, lying on its side the way a tired man lies down when he's done pretending. Kenneth had been adding to that pile for 28 years, and in 28 years nobody had ever come back there before 7 in the morning to take anything out of it, until today. Kenneth heard the scrape first, metal dragging across gravel. He was standing at the coffee machine inside, watching the burner glow orange beneath the pot, and the sound came in through the thin wall of the shop like something he'd imagined. Except he hadn't imagined it. He set the cup down, walked to the back door, pushed it open. A young man had both hands wrapped around a cracked farmal block and was hauling it toward a pickup truck that looked older than he was. Didn't knock, didn't call ahead, didn't look up. There was a composition notebook tucked under his left arm, pressed tight against his ribs, and his fingers were already black at the knuckles, with grease at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in March. Kenneth watched him for a moment. Not suspicious. Something else. Something closer to the feeling a man gets when he sees a bird build a nest and realizes the has been doing engineering all along without anybody handing it a degree. The young man loaded the farmal block into the bed of the pickup, then turned back toward the pile. That was when Kenneth stepped out into the cold. "Those are scraps, son." The young man didn't stop moving, didn't break stride, reached into the pile, got his hands around a second block and started pulling. His voice came out even, not rude, not nervous, like he'd already had this conversation in his head on the drive over and had decided exactly how it would go. "I know, sir. That's why I want them." Kenneth stood there in the gravel with the March cold sitting on his shoulders like a wet coat and looked at this kid. The notebook, the grease, the way he moved with his whole body committed to the task before the task had even agreed to cooperate. Kenneth asked the only question that ever told him anything real about a person. "What in the world are you building?" The young man set the second block in the truck bed and straightened up. He looked at Kenneth for the first time. Not like he was asking permission. Like he was deciding whether the question deserved an honest answer. "A foundry." He turned back to the pile. Kenneth stood in the gravel for another 3 seconds. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Then he went back inside and poured his coffee and stood at the tool and watched the truck pull out of the lot, and he didn't say another word about it. Not that morning. Not for 6 weeks after. He just let the pile get smaller and kept his thoughts the way a man keeps certain tools locked in a drawer because the time to use them hasn't come yet. His name was Thomas Jackson, 19 years old, second of 3 children, son of Harold Reed, who had farmed 320 acres in the northeast corner of Hardin County since 1961, and grandson of a man's who had come up from a coal town in Monroe County, where everything had once been possible until the mines closed and then nothing was. Would you treat them with kindness? And the people who had built their lives there found out how quickly possible becomes past tense when somebody else controls the ground beneath your feet. The northeast corner was where Harold's father had bought, because that was where someone was finally willing to sell. Harold had never moved the line. He farmed the same ground his father had bought at the edge of what was available, and he farmed it with the kind of relentless precision that makes a man invisible in the best way possible. 3 decades of yield records that said he hadn't been wrong about a single decision. Not one. The corn came in when he said it would. The beans ran where he planted them. The soil did what he asked, because he had spent 30 years learning to ask it the right questions in the right season. 200 farms in Hardin County. One of them belonged to a black family. Everybody knew which one. Thomas had grown up in that fact the way you grow up in a house with a low door frame. You learn where it is. You stop hitting your head. But you never stop knowing it's there. He swept floors at Kenneth Lee's machine shop on Saturdays for $2.50 an hour. The money was real. It covered things that needed covering. But the money was not the reason he had taken the job. The reason was standing permission to dig through whatever was out back. And for a particular kind of 19-year-old, that permission was worth more than the hourly rate, and both of them knew it without either of them ever saying so. The composition books had started when he was 17. The black and white marble cover kind. 25 cents at the drugstore in Eldora. By the March, he dragged those blocks out of Kenneth's pile. He was on his 4th one, and not a single page in any of them was wasted on things that didn't matter. No journal entries. No doodles. No copied-out lyrics to songs he liked. Numbers. Dimensions. Sketches of components cut in half and redrawn from different angles, over and over, until the line stopped wobbling and started meaning something. Dealer prices for 37 separate components with the part numbers written in the margin. Cost of raw iron per pound from 3 different suppliers in Iowa. Temperature ranges. Tensile strength tables copied out of a metallurgy manual he had found in the back stacks of the Eldora Public Library and checked out 6 times in 2 years. He had not been studying tractors. He had been studying what tractors were made of. Would you treat them with kindness? Here was the thing he had figured out sitting at the kitchen table while his father was on the phone with the bank, and his mother was working the night shift at the county hospital, and his sister Vanessa was at the table across from him with her own books open, not farming books, accounting textbooks, because Vanessa Carter had decided at 17 that numbers were a language, and she was going to be fluent. The biggest controllable expense on a family farm was not seed, not fertilizer, not fuel. It was parts. A crankshaft for a John Deere 4440 cost $460 at the dealer counter in 1987. Hydraulic housings, PTO components, transmission cases, water pump covers. The list went on for pages, and the prices did not negotiate, and there was exactly one place in Hardin County to get any of it. When a man's equipment failed in the middle of planting season, he paid whatever they asked, because the alternative was watching his crop go in late. And in farming, late was just a longer way of saying lost. Thomas had run the arithmetic 3 separate times across 2 years. 3 times. Same answer. A part the dealer charged $400 for was, underneath the paint and the stamped part number, a few dollars of iron. The difference wasn't the material. The difference was who owned the furnace. He might have carried that understanding around in those notebooks for another 2 years and done nothing with it. Knowing a thing and acting on a thing are separated by a distance that looks short on a map and turns out to be longer than the map suggested. He might have stayed in the knowing and left the acting alone for a good while longer, except for the 2nd week of February. He came in through the back door after checking on the equipment shed and stopped in the mudroom because he could hear his father on the telephone in the kitchen. Harold's voice was low. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind of low that isn't quiet on purpose but is quiet because the person speaking has pulled it down close to his chest so it doesn't carry further than it has to. Thomas stood in the mudroom in his coat and his boots, and he listened to a conversation he was not supposed to hear, and he heard every word of it. Harold was talking to the loan officer at the bank in Iowa Falls. The operating note came up for review in June. The bank would carry the Reeds 1 more year. 1 more. The bank would not carry $1 additional of new debt on top of that note. Not one. Which meant the following. From that moment until the crop was in the ground, Every breakdown on those 320 acres had to be paid in cash. The Reed family did not have cash. They had land. They had a 14-year-old tractor that had been kept alive through 3 winters by Thomas's own hands, and Harold's knowledge of which noises to ignore and which ones to fix immediately. They had a margin so thin you could read a newspaper through it. They had 30 years of records that proved Harold Reed was a good farmer, and they had no cash. Harold hung up, stood there. Thomas could hear him breathing through the wall. Then the sound of boots on the kitchen floor moving toward the window that faced out toward the equipment shed, the way Harold always moved toward whatever he was worrying about, as though putting his eyes on it helped. Thomas went upstairs without letting the door make noise. He sat on the edge of his bed, with the notebook open on his knees, and he sat there for a long time, not panicking. That wasn't his way. He didn't spiral, and he didn't catastrophize, and he didn't start making calculations that had no basis in fact. He just sat with what he now knew. He did not decide to build a foundry that night. He decided he had until June. 9 days later, he picked a Sunday evening. After a good supper, after his father had sat with a cup of coffee and the comfortable quiet that follows a meal and a day without disasters, Thomas set the notebook on the table and beside it a single sheet of paper with 2 columns of numbers. Every dollar the family had spent on parts in the previous year, copied line by line from Harold's receipts. In the left column, what the iron in those parts actually cost, based on 3 months of research and supplier pricing. In the right column, he did not make a speech. He did not lead with an explanation. He said 4 words. I want to build a foundry. Harold Reed set down his coffee cup. At the sink, Lorraine Mitchell stopped moving. She did not turn around. In the kitchen, those 2 things meant the same thing. Lorraine was 55 years old and beautiful, in the way that 3 decades of holding things together will make a woman beautiful. Not soft and untested, but strong and specific, like a tool made for a particular purpose, and worn smooth from use. She worked 3 shifts a week in the laundry at the county hospital, and she understood with precision what it cost to be the only person in a room. She had understood it for 30 years. Her not turning around was not disinterest. It was everything. Harold looked at the notebook where it lay on the table. He looked at it the way a man looks at a document he suspects contains information that will require him to change his position, and he has not decided yet whether he's ready to change it. Thomas pushed the sheet of paper across. Harold still didn't pick up either one. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, which was what he did instead of raising his voice. Then he said the part that cost him something to get out. And Thomas knew it cost him something because Harold looked down at the table before he said it, like a man checking his footing before he steps onto ice. When George White wrecks a tractor, people say George White wrecked a tractor. A pause. 1 full beat. When you burn down a building, that is not a story about a building. The kitchen went the specific kind of quiet that happens when something true gets said. Lorraine turned off the water at the sink. She still didn't turn around. Thomas looked at the sheet of paper in front of him. He pushed it another inch toward his father and waited. He had prepared for the fire objection. He had prepared for the liability objection. He had not entirely prepared for the weight of that particular truth, which landed differently than he expected, and he let it land rather than trying to redirect it, because redirecting it would have been dishonest. Harold looked at the right column on the page. He was a man who had spent 30 years living and dying by numbers. He knew the difference between a number that wanted something to be true and a number that was simply reporting what was. He looked at that page for a long time, longer than Thomas expected. Then Harold said, I need to think about it. He did not close the notebook. Thomas went out to the porch after to get his coat, and Lorraine was already there, folding a dish towel over the railing in the cold. The kind of cold that makes the air taste like iron. She didn't tell him she was proud of him. She didn't tell him to let it go. Those weren't the options she was offering. Your father isn't wrong about the talk. She folded the towel again, smaller than it needed to be. So whatever you do out there, you're going to be twice as careful as anybody ever thought to ask you to be. Every single time. Thomas looked at her. Why? Because that's the only thing I've ever seen work. She handed him the towel to carry inside. That was how she ended a conversation. Would you treat them with kindness? He took the towel inside, and he thought about those words for the rest of that night, and he thought about them for years after, turning them over the way you turn over a piece of iron to find the weight of it. Was she warning him? Was she arming him? Both, maybe. The kind of both that doesn't resolve into one or the other, no matter how long you think about it. 11 days. Thomas counted everyone. He did not ask once. He went to school. He went to Kenneth's shop on Saturday and pushed the broom and hauled oil drums and said nothing about any of it. Would you treat them with kindness? He ate dinner with his family, and he helped Vanessa with the column she couldn't balance, and he went out to the equipment shed in the evenings and ran his hands over the tractor's hydraulic lines the way you run your hands over something you're trying to keep alive by attention alone. Day 11, Harold came out to the equipment shed in the afternoon. His hands were in his coat pockets. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the shelf where Thomas had started keeping the notebooks, at the tools arranged along the wall with the particular order that says someone is treating the work seriously. You can use the old granary. Harold paused. The granary sat at the edge of the yard, 30 by 40 feet plank walls that had been standing since 1931, a dirt floor packed hard as concrete, a roof that had been losing its argument with gravity for 3 winters. 3 things. Thomas waited. He had learned young not to grab at the first sentence. 1. You don't pour anything that carries a man's weight, and you don't pour anything that spins at PTO speed. Not for us, not for anyone, not for money. I don't care how good you get. Yes, sir. 2. You don't light a fire in that building unless there is a person over 18 in this house. Not one time. Yes, sir. 3. Every dollar goes into a book and Vanessa keeps it. Because I've watched you count and I've watched her count. Thomas nodded. Harold looked past him at the granary, at the pigeons walking along the roof line, at the door hanging slightly off its hinge. That's not a yes. That's a lot of rope. He went back to the house. Thomas stood in the equipment shed for a moment, after his father left, and looked at the granary, across the yard, and felt the particular quality of a door, swinging open onto something you've been imagining for so long, that the actual open door looks smaller than the imagined one. Then he went to the granary and started measuring. The roof was the first problem. 3 sections of it had gone soft, and 1 section had gone further than soft, had gone all the way to compromised, which in a building you're going to run a live furnace in means the roof is going to get fixed before anything else happens. He found sheet metal salvaged off a collapsed machine shed 2 farms over. He spent a week on the roof with a borrowed nail gun, and his brother Terry Coleman helping from the ladder. Terry being 18's, and currently occupying the specific territory of 18-year-old brother, which meant enthusiastic and unreliable in roughly equal measure, but always willing to hold the ladder and never willing to admit he was scared of heights. The pigeons were next. Hardware cloth over the vents. A week of patient blockading that involved more aerial negotiation than Thomas had expected. Pigeons are not reasonable, but they are persistent, and persistence loses to infrastructure. The floor was already good. 30 years of compression had taken care of the floor, hard as anything poured. Then he started building the furnace. The body of it came from a 12-inch pipe section he cut from the dead grain auger in Kenneth's pile. The same pile he'd been pulling from since February. He lined it with fire clay from a masonry supplier in Iowa Falls, driving there on a Wednesday afternoon, with $30 from the coffee can, and a list of specifications he'd pulled from a metallurgy handbook. He welded the pipe to a steel base plate from the scrap pile. He ran the air supply from a blower motor he'd pulled from a wrecked grain dryer that Kenneth had let him take. The blower feeding into the bottom through a pipe offset at 12 degrees because the book said airflow needed to spiral inside the charge chamber, not blow straight up through it. 4 feet tall, ugly as sin and real. He ran electrical to it from the granary's single outlet, stealing enough amperage to make the blower run without tripping the breaker, which required math he did twice and confirmed with a wiring guide from the library, and then did one more time because he was not interested in finding out he had been wrong about amperage the way you find out you were wrong about ice depth. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa came out to look at it the night before he planned to light it for the first time. She was 21 years old, and she had started accounting classes at the community college in Ames, and she had a quality of attention that made you feel accurately observed, not judged but counted, like a figure in a column that she intended to get right. She was beautiful the way that Lorraine was beautiful specifically, as though her face had been designed to express things that most faces can only approximate. She walked around the furnace twice, looked at the blower fitting, looked at the baseplate welds. You should let me keep a log. Thomas looked at her. Not because Dad said to. A real one. Heat by heat. Materials cost time. What you poured. What you got. He thought about it for 2 seconds. Yeah, good. She pulled a composition book out from under her arm, one she'd already started. The first entry was already in it, in her handwriting, the date and the furnace specifications. She had written it before she'd asked him. He didn't say anything about that, but he noticed it, and he filed it away in the part of his brain that kept track of people who were already doing the work before anyone asked. The 29th of March, he lit it. Everything failed. He had started with the simplest possible casting he could conceive. A drawbar clevis, a lump of iron that connects an implement to the drawbar of a tractor and has almost no critical dimensions anywhere on its body. Nothing has to fit precisely. Nothing has to seal against pressure. It just has to hold, and holding is the first thing iron does if you let it. He figured it was a reasonable place to start. The iron melted. That part worked. He'd packed the furnace with coke and broken engine block from the scrap pile and run the blower for 40 minutes and watched the color of the melt shift from the orange of cooking fire to the orange-white of something that had gone past hot into a different category of heat entirely. He'd built a sand mold in a wooden flask he'd made from scrap lumber, pressed around a pattern he'd carved from pine. He'd tapped the furnace through a small hole in the base with a steel rod. The iron came out in a stream that threw sparks across the dirt floor and lit the inside of that granary orange and gold. And for 90 seconds Thomas Jackson thought he had it. He poured it into the mold. He stepped back. He felt the heat on his face from 4 feet away. He waited the time the book said to wait. He cracked the mold open. A crack ran through the casting like a fault line, clean and definitive, wall to wall. He tapped it with a hammer the way you tap something you're hoping will stay together. It came apart in his hands in 2 pieces. In the doorway, Vanessa wrote in the book she'd started without being asked. Her handwriting even and unhurried. Heat 1, 4.1, nothing. He stood at the bench for a moment, with the 2 pieces of broken casting in his hands. He set them down, he looked at them. He picked up the notebook he carried and he wrote 3 questions. Not conclusions. Questions. What was wrong with the mold? What was wrong with the pour? What was wrong with the cooling time? Then he built another mold and ran another heat. Heat 2 was worse. The sand mix had moisture in it he hadn't dried out, and when the iron hit the mold face, the moisture flashed to steam instantly and blew the top half of the mold apart, with a sound like a gunshot in a closed room, which is to say a very alarming sound, the kind that makes your heart do something involuntary before your brain has caught up enough to tell it to stop. Sand went in every direction. Iron spatter hit the base of the wall and fizzled on the dirt floor. Nothing caught. Nothing burned. But the casting was ruined before it had been a casting for more than a quarter of a second. Thomas stood in the smoke and the sand with his heart doing the involuntary thing and swept the floor and said nothing about it at dinner. Vanessa put it in the book. Heat 2, 4.8, nothing. Heat 3. The iron froze solid halfway down the sprue channel and left him a metal plug shaped like the mistake it was. No casting. Just an expensive way to turn coke into regret. Heat 3, 3.4, nothing. $12.30 all told. 3 heats. Nothing on the bench but broken iron and a young man sitting on the hard dirt floor of a granary in March, understanding for the first time, with his whole body, with his all rather than just his head that, knowing the theory of a thing and doing the thing, are separated by a gap that is wide and cold, and does not particularly care how many books you have read. He sat on the floor for a while. Not dramatically. Not in despair. He sat the way a man sits when he has discovered that the problem is more complicated than he thought it was, and he is rearranging his understanding to fit the new information. He wrote 3 pages in the notebook. Almost all questions. What is the sand doing wrong? What is the cooling doing wrong? What is the pour doing wrong? He did not have answers. He was making a map of what he did not know, because a map of ignorance is the first step toward making it smaller. He went back to Kenneth's shop the following Saturday and pushed the broom across the floor with a piece of the broken clevis in his coat pocket. He had started carrying it with him, turning it over in his hand when he was thinking. There was something about the texture of it, the specific rough, smooth quality of iron that cooled wrong, that kept him honest. It was evidence that the gap existed. He didn't want to forget the gap existed. It fell out when he hung his coat on the hook inside the door. Kenneth Lee was behind the workbench, rebuilding a carburetor with the focused patience of a man who has done this specific thing several hundred times and has no interest in rushing any of the several hundred and first. He heard the piece hit the floor. He set down the carburetor. He picked up the piece of broken clevis before Thomas could reach it. Then he did something strange. He held it up close to his face. He turned it toward the window to get the light. He smelled it. Thomas stopped moving. Kenneth set the piece on the bench and lowered himself onto his shop stool, with the deliberateness of a man whose knees have been storing complaints for several decades and have started presenting them all at once. You poured that, cold. Thomas stood very still. How could you possibly know that? This is what nobody in Hardin County under 40 knew about Kenneth Lee. Before the machine shop, from 1946 to 1958, he had worked as a molder at a gray iron foundry in Waterloo, Iowa. 12 years on a pouring floor. Would you treat them with kindness? He knew the weight of a full ladle from the sound it made when you tapped it. He knew what a mold looked like when it was breathing right and when it wasn't. He knew how to read the iron surface after it cooled the way a doctor reads a chest X-ray. Not just for what's there, but for what should be there and isn't. He had quit in 1958 when a doctor counted the silica dust in his lungs and told him the simplest possible truth about what happens to a man who breathes fine particulate for 12 years in a building with inadequate ventilation. He opened the machine shop. He was good at it. He did not miss the foundry. He did not talk about it. For 28 years, nobody in his orbit had given him a reason to, until now. Kenneth sat on the stool and looked at the broken casting, and for a second he did not look like a 71-year-old man sitting on a stool in a machine shop in Iowa. He looked like somebody younger standing on a pouring floor, reading iron the way some men read weather. Books give you the temperature. He nodded at the clevis piece. They don't give you the hurry. Thomas didn't say anything. He stood and waited. Iron's got a temper, son. You pour like you're scared of it. It'll punish you every time. You had about 9 seconds in a mold that size. He paused. I'd guess you took 20. Thomas had taken 22. He'd timed himself because he timed everything. He said nothing. Kenneth told him 3 things that morning that were not in any book Thomas had been able to find in 2 years of library visits. He told him how a mold has to breathe, not just be an empty space, but an active participant in the process. Vented in the right places, so the gas the iron displaces has somewhere to go that isn't back into the casting. He told him how to build a running system for the iron, a road rather than a hole, with a tapered sprue and a runner, an ingate sized to control the velocity of the metal as it fills. And he told him about speed, not the temperature. Speed. How the race starts the moment the iron leaves the ladle, and everything after that is borrowed time. And borrowed time in a foundry is the kind of debt that collects with interest. Thomas wrote it down standing up because sitting down would have taken time he didn't have. When he was done writings, he asked the question that had been building in his chest for 20 minutes. He asked why Kenneth hadn't said anything when it was clear from the size of the growing hole in his scrap pile, that something involving molten iron was being built on the Reed property. Kenneth picked up the broken clevis piece and turned it over, set it face down on the bench. Figured you'd quit by the second week. He looked out the window at the diminished pile. Most do. Thomas walked home with kindness. Thomas walked home that arm with the notebook under arm and the broken casting in his pocket, and 3 pages of new information that changed the shape of the problem. He ran heat 4 that evening with a redesigned mold, and a pour that took 9 seconds flat because he counted. Count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, out loud in the empty granary, with only the furnace and the molds and the dirt floor for company. The casting cracked. But it cracked differently. A shrinkage crack near the riser, not a cold pour crack through the body. He wrote it down. Different cause. Different solution. Heat 5. He eliminated the shrinkage crack by feeding more iron into the riser. The casting came out with a surface defect he hadn't expected. Small but present. A region near the parting line where the mold had shifted slightly on pour. He shimmed the flask with a cedar wedge. Wrote it down. Heat 6. The clevis came out whole. He stood at the bench in the granary, with the mold cracked open, and the casting sitting on the wooden surface, and he looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he ran his thumb along the surface. Even. No cracks he could feel. He tapped it with a hammer. Solid. The sound was different from the broken pieces. Solid has a particular sound that hollow and crack don't have, a fullness in the ring, like the difference between a bell that works and a bell with a chip. He picked it up. It was warm. It was, as far as he could tell, a drawbar clevis. He carried it into the kitchen that night and set it on the table beside his father's plate, without saying anything, because saying anything would have turned it into a speech. And it wasn't a speech, it was a piece of iron. Harold picked it up. He turned it over. He hefted it, the specific way a farmer hefts a piece of iron when he wants to know if it's serious. He set it back down beside his plate. He ate the rest of the supper with it sitting there. He did not move it. He did not comment on it. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't dismissal either. And in the language Harold Reed used to communicate about things that mattered, not moving it and not commenting on it was as close to acknowledgement as the first week of a new thing was going to get. Vanessa put it in the book that night. Heat 6, 3.9, 1 clevis whole. Thomas went back to the granary after dinner and started planning Heat 7. The granary in those weeks had its own particular smell. Coke smoke and hot metal and the specific mineral quality of heated sand, underlaid by the older smell of the building itself. Oak and age and the particular damp that lives in old wood no matter how dry the season. He got used to it the way you get used to any environment you inhabit long enough. It stopped being remarkable. It became the smell of work. He was averaging 1 heat every 2 days. Not because the process with kindness. Not because the process took that long, but because he was learning at each heat and he needed time between to study what he had learned and adjust the variables before he ran the next one. He kept a separate sheet for each heat. Materials in, time, temperature by color, pour speed, cooling time. Result, what failed and where, what worked and why he thought it worked. By heat 9 he was producing belt idlers. Simple geometry. An idler is a wheel, essentially, with a bore through the center, and it exists to keep a drive belt tracking correctly. It doesn't carry significant load. It doesn't seal anything. It just has to be round and concentric. Heat 9 came out round, enough that he could measure the bore with his calipers and find it within acceptable tolerance. Vanessa wrote it in the book. Then she added a second column she had not been asked to add. What the part would have cost at the dealer counter versus what it had cost to pour. She added that column going back to Heat 6 and kept it going forward. Thomas looked at the second column the night she showed it to him. He looked at it for a moment without Sue speaking. Then he went back out to the granary, and he understood, in a way that the individual heats had not quite made clear to him, what the project actually was. Heat 14 brought him to the first real wall. He poured a water pump cover for the old farmall, a real part. A part on an actual machine that was currently sitting in the equipment shed doing its job. or rather failing to do its job, because the pump cover had developed a seep at its mounting face that Harold had been managing with a rag and a watchful eye for going on 4 months. Thomas had treated them with kindness. Thomas had carved the pattern from pine over 3 evenings, using the original part to establish the geometry, measuring every surface with calipers and transferring the dimensions to the pattern with a tolerance of plus or minus a 32nd of an inch, which for a water pump cover is sufficient. The casting came out clean, and then he held it in his hands and understood the wall. A casting that hasn't been machined is a shape, not a part. The bore of the pump cover had to be brought to dimension on a lathe. The mounting face had to be milled flat to within a few thousandths. The holes had to be drilled and tapped. He had a granary. He had a furnace. He did not have a lathe. He thought about this for 2 days. The vocational school in Eldora had a metal shop. He had passed it 100 times. Lathe mill, drill press, surface grinder. A full setup behind a window he had looked through more times than he had counted. Timothy Clark taught the shop class there. He was 44 years old, white-haired before his time, and known treat them with kindness, and known throughout Hardin County primarily for an encyclopedic knowledge of machinery tolerances, and a habit of identifying which students were worth staying late for, and then staying late for them without ever making a production of it. Thomas had you treat them with kindness. CS's vocational class for a semester 2 years prior, and had completed every assignment before the class was half over, and then spent the rest of the semester helping other students figure out why their projects weren't working, which Timothy had pretended not to notice, while noticing very carefully. Thomas went to see him on a Tuesday afternoon. He brought the pattern he'd carved, the casting he'd poured, and the composition book with the results of all 14 heats. He laid them on Timothy's desk and did not say anything while Timothy looked through them. Timothy went through the notebook carefully. He read it the way a man reads something he is deciding the weight of, slowly, going back to reread sections. He was quiet for a long time. After hours, Timothy said finally, "Side door. 9 o'clock is the hard cutoff, and if anybody asks, you were never here." That lasted for 3 weeks, which is to say, it lasted until the night the principal came back to the school for a folder he'd left in his office, and saw the lights on in the metal shop at 8:15 on a Wednesday evening, and walked in to find a 19-year-old black man he had never seen before standing alone at the lathe, with a casting in the chuck and chips of iron on the floor. Thomas turned off the lathe. He stood in the hallway outside the principal's office for 20 minutes, while 2 men talked about him behind a closed door. He stood with his back straight and his hands at his sides, and he listened to the low rumble of voices without being able to make out words, and he thought about the numbers on the pump cover pattern, and whether the bore was going to come to spec before 9 o'clock if he could get back on the machine. When the door opened, it was Timothy who came out. He didn't look angry. That was the part that stayed with Thomas afterward. Timothy looked tired in a specific way, the tired of a man who has spent something that doesn't replenish easily. He looked at Thomas with the expression of someone taking inventory of a situation they had walked into willingly and are not going to complain about but are also not going to pretend is comfortable. "You know what I put on the line in there for you?" Thomas held his gaze. "Yes, sir." "Then don't make me a liar." He put the key back in Thomas's hand, firm, without ceremony, and turned back toward the office. Thomas stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went back into the metal shop, turned the lathe back on, and finished the bore to spec in 40 minutes. The pump cover went on the Farmall that Saturday. Thomas packed the mounting face with a new gasket cut from sheet stock, torqued the bolts to spec, started the engine. Let the coolant warm up and cycle through the system. Watched the mounting face. No seep, no drip. The repair that Harold had been managing with a rag for 4 months was gone. Harold came out of the equipment shed and stood beside the tractor and looked at the pump cover for a moment. He did not say anything. He picked up the rag he'd been keeping near the radiator and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Then he walked back to the house. That was Harold's way of saying a thing was done correctly. Thomas went back to the granary and wrote up Heat 14 in Vanessa's book, and then stood at the workbench, looking at the shelf of patterns he had accumulated. 4 now. A drawbar clevis, a belt idler, a water pump cover, and a rough cut at a bracket pattern he hadn't poured yet. Outside, through the granary's one small window, the yard was dark. The house lights were on. He could see the kitchen window from where he stood. His mother was in there. He could see her moving past the window the way you can see a person moving in a lit room when you're standing in the dark outside it. She had told him, twice as careful, every single time. Not because it's fair. He hadn't needed to ask. He'd understood the rest of the sentence before she finished it, because the only alternative was performing carefulness in reaction to something going wrong, and by then the damage was already done. He turned off the granary light and walked to the house through the March cold and went inside to have whatever was left of supper. By the second week of April, he had a system. Find a worn part somebody had thrown away. Buy it for what it weighed in scrap. Take it apart in his head. Carve the pattern. Pour the part. Machine it to spec on the lathe at the vocational school after 8:30. Test it. He had 4 patterns on the shelf. He needed 5. What he needed next was a hydraulic pump housing off a 4,240. That was the part that showed up most often in Harold's receipts. That was the part, Keat, that showed up most often in the receipts he'd gotten from 3 other farms in the county when he'd gone around asking. Because he had gone around asking, quietly, over the winter, would you treat them with kindness? Whether he could look at old receipts from the last few years in exchange for helping with whatever needed doing that day. 4 farms. Same answer. Hydraulic pump housing was the part that ate money fastest. The only worn one in Hardin County that wasn't currently installed on a machine was sitting in the used parts bin at the John Deere dealership in Eldora. He'd confirmed that on a Saturday in March, when he'd come in to look at a belt and happened to be standing close enough to the used parts bin to see what was in it. He drove in on a Tuesday morning. 3 men at the counter when he walked through the door. Ronald Sanchez behind it, 54 years old, 19 years behind that specific counter, the kind of man who treats his position as the custodian of all relevant information and takes that custodianship seriously. George White leaning against the counter on the customer side, which was where George White could be found most mornings, because 800 acres west of town gives a man a certain gravitational pull on the social fabric of a dealership waiting area. And one other man whose name Thomas didn't know, there for a filter, checking his watch. Ronald didn't laugh first. He did something else, something Thomas had been braced for since the parking lot. Would you treat them with kindness? He looked at Thomas with the reflexive assessment that had nothing to do with Thomas specifically, and everything to do with the question it had never occurred to Ronald to stop asking. Running parts for somebody, son? The words were ordinary. The tone was the specific tone that 19 years behind a particular counter in a particular county will produce in a man, without him noticing it's happened. Thomas had been asked that question in that exact cadence by men who meant nothing by it, and men who meant everything by it, and he had long ago given up trying to tell them apart in advance. My father. Harold Reed, 6 miles northeast. Harold. Ronald nodded the slow nod of a man filing something in the correct drawer. What's he need? He doesn't need anything. I want the cracked housing out of your used bin, whatever it weighs in scrap. George White turned around. George White farmed 800 acres, which in Hardin County gave a man a specific kind of authority that attached itself to everything he said, even the things he said at a parts counter on a Tuesday morning while waiting for a hydraulic filter. He turned around and looked at Thomas with the full, easy confidence of a man who has never had to justify his right to have an opinion. What's a man want with a broke housing? Thomas could have lied. He had thought about lying, in the truck, in the parking lot, while he was walking across the lot toward the door. He had constructed a plausible version of the truth that would have been technically accurate and would not have led where the truth led. He told the truth. I'm going to make a pattern of it. Then I'm going to pour my own. The silence was exactly 2 seconds long. George White started laughing, and Ronald Sanchez laughed with him. And the man checking his watch made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in the same family. It was not cruel laughter, not exactly. It was worse than that. It was the laughter of men whose minds had sorted the incoming information into the category of joke before it had a chance to be evaluated as a proposal. The category of things that couldn't be what they sounded like. The category reserved for statements so far outside the expected that the reasonable response to the men making it was to treat the speaker kindly and move on. George White settled back against the counter with the ease of a man who has never once in his life been made to feel that his presence in any room required justification. "Son, I've been farming since before your daddy owned that ground. He let it hang there long enough. You know what you just described to me? A way to lose a hand and burn down a building on the very same afternoon." Thomas stood there. In the truck he had the bore tolerance of that exact housing, the result of every heat he'd run since March, the cost per unit calculations across 14 separate castings. Would you treat them with kindness? He had the accounting column Vanessa had been keeping since heat 6 that showed what the parts would have cost at this counter versus what they had cost him to pour. He could have opened his mouth and laid it all out on that counter and watched the room change. He didn't. His mother had told him. He had worked it out himself by a different route and arrived at the same conclusion. A 19-year-old who wins an argument at a parts counter has still lost the afternoon, and he didn't have afternoons to lose. He asked one question. How much? Ronald looked at the tag on the housing. He looked at Thomas. Would you treat them with kindness? He looked at the $2.50 already sitting on the counter, which Thomas had put there while they were still talking. Something in the room shifted about a quarter of an inch in a direction that didn't have a name. $2.50. Thomas walked out with the housing under his arm. George White said something behind him that got another laugh, and Thomas heard it through the glass of the closing door, and he kept walking. Steady, the same pace he'd walked in with. He put the housing in the truck bed and got in and drove north out of Eldora toward the farm. He kept the receipt. $2.50. Handwritten by Ronald Sanchez. Date stamped. It went into the composition book that night, taped to the inside cover of Volume 4, and it would remain there for years, and years after that, not because anyone asked him to keep it, but because it was the first transaction in a business that didn't exist yet, and he knew that even then, would you treat them with kindness? Sitting in the truck on the road home with the cracked housing in the bed, and George White's laughter still faintly audible at the back of his mind, that things which are beginning deserve to be documented. He drove home through the flat land of Hardin County, in the last of the afternoon light, the field still brown from winter, the sky doing the Iowa thing it does in early spring where it can't make up its mind whether to be promising or threatening, and settles on both. He drove with his hands at 10 and 2, and his mind already in the granary, already at the workbench, already measuring the housing, already building the pattern in his head. The land ran flat in every direction. 320 acres in the northeast corner. A granary with a furnace inside it that was getting better. A notebook with questions that were getting more specific. A deadline in June that was not moving. He turned into the long gravel drive and parked by the equipment shed and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, looking at the granary. The light was low, and the building sat at the edge of the yard the way old buildings sit, settled into the ground, not going anywhere, having already outlasted whatever doubts anyone had about whether it would last. He got out, took the housing from the bed, walked to the granary, opened the door, started measuring. The pattern for the hydraulic pump housing took 11 days to carve, not because it was complicated. Exactly. It was complicated. But the 11 days were not about the complexity. They were about the margin for error, which in a hydraulic pump housing is almost none, because a hydraulic pump housing lives with oil under pressure, and any void or misrun in the casting wall becomes a leak, and a leak in a hydraulic system becomes a failure, and a failure in a hydraulic system at the wrong moment in planting season becomes the specific disaster that Thomas had been building toward preventing since February. So the 11 days were about getting it right before he got anywhere near the furnace, because the furnace does not give refunds. He worked from the cracked housing he'd bought from Ronald Sanchez's for $2.50, measuring every surface with calipers until he knew the geometry, the way he knew the layout of the granary, by feel as much as by number. He carved the pattern from basswood, which cuts cleaner than pine and holds its dimensions better when the shop heats up. He made the core box for the internal cavity from the same material. He built the pattern in halves. Because a pump housing has a potting line, and ignoring the tower line is the fastest way to produce a casting that looks correct and assembles wrong. Vanessa came out on day 9 and looked at the pattern without touching it. She walked around the bench and looked at it from 4 angles. Then she said, "The boss dimension on the mounting flange." She pointed at a feature near the bottom of the pattern. "You're going to need a 1/2,000th more stock there for cleanup." Thomas looked at the feature. He had been looking at it for 2 days and had not resolved the question she had just resolved by looking at it for 40 seconds. He added the stock. She went back inside. He finished the pattern on day 11 and made 4 molds from it over 2 days, packing each one with kindness and checking the moisture content before each pour, because heat too had taught him the lesson about moisture, the way that only a bang in a closed room at night can really teach it. He poured heat 15 on an evening in mid-April, when the temperature outside was still cold enough to see your breath, but the granary was warm from the furnace and smelled of hot metal and burned coke and the particular mineral quality of sand at working temperature. The housing came out with a shrinkage sink on the inner bore wall. Small, but located exactly where the pump shaft ran, which made it not small in any practical sense. He poured heat 16, a misrun on the outlet port. Heat 17. He shifted the gating entirely, rebuilt the runner system from scratch based on what Kenneth had told him about building a road for the iron rather than a hole to dump it into, and ran the pour at the fastest speed he had ever attempted, 9 seconds for a mold that wanted to freeze him out if he gave it the chance. Heat 17 came out clean. He held the casting under the granary's single work light and turned it in his hands and checked every surface he could reach with his fingertips. And the casting was, as far as he could determine, a hydraulic pump housing for a John Deere 4240. Rough. Unfinished. A shape that still needed the lathe and the mill and the drill press before it became a part. But the iron was sound, and the walls were solid, and the ports were where the ports were supposed to be, and the flange face was flat enough that he could lay a straight edge across it and see only the finest line of light at one edge, which the machining would correct. He put it in the truck and drove to the vocational school and let himself in through the side door at 8:40 and set the casting in the chuck and ran the bore to dimension and milled the mounting face flat and drilled and tapped the bolt holes, while Timothy Clark sat in the shop office with his feet on the desk reading something and asking absolutely nothing, which was its own kind of teaching. The finished part sat on Thomas's workbench in the granary for 3 days. He looked at it every night. It was not installed on anything. It was not doing any work. It was just sitting there, a proof of concept with a surface finish that wasn't beautiful but was correct, and for 3 days that was sufficient. He had 5 patterns on the shelf now. He was starting to understand something that the notebooks had not quite prepared him for. The foundry was not the hard part. The foundry was learnable. Would you treat them with kindness? Every problem it threw at him was a problem with a technical answer, and the technical answer was findable if you were willing to fail enough times on the way to finding it. The hard part was the system around the foundry. The patterns took time. The machining took time, and a borrowed lathe, and the continued goodwill of a teacher who had already put something real on the line for him. The sand supply and the coke and the raw iron from the scrap pile were finite. Would you treat them with kindness? He was working inside constraints that pressed on him from every direction, and the constraints were not going to get more generous as the project grew. Would you thinking about this? On a Saturday morning in late April, pushing the broom across Kenneth's shop floor in the particular rhythm that broom pushing produces in the mind, which is somewhere between meditation and calculation, when the phone in the shop office rang. Kenneth answered it. Low conversation Thomas couldn't hear over the furnace noise from the adjacent bay. Kenneth came out 3 minutes later with his coat already half on. Got to go out to the Bergman place. Hydraulic issue on a combine. He looked at Thomas. Lock up if you finish before I'm back. Thomas nodded. Kenneth was out the door. Thomas pushed the broom for another 10 minutes. Would you treat them with kindness? Then he stopped pushing the broom and stood in the middle of the shop and looked at the wall of equipment manuals on the shelf above the workbench. Kenneth had been collecting those manuals for 28 years. Every major brand, every model year he could get his hands on. The shelf ran 12 feet and was doubled stacked in places. Thomas had been looking at that shelf for a year and a half. He walked to the shelf. He found the 4,240 hydraulics section. He pulled the manual and carried it to bench and opened it to the pump assembly diagram. He was not looking for something specific. Would you treat them with kindness? He was looking at the diagram the way he had learned to look at problems, not for the answer but for the question he hadn't thought to ask yet. The phone rang again. Thomas looked at it. It rang 3 more times. He answered it. It was Harold. The hydraulic pump housing on the 4,240 cracked. Steady voice, Harold's voice. The voice of a man reporting a fact he has processed to the point of presentation. I called the dealership. 4 to 7 business days. Thomas looked at the diagram open on the workbench. The silence between them was 4 seconds long. 4 to 7 business days in late April in Iowa was not a parts delay. It was a planting delay. A planting delay was measured in bushels, and bushels, at that specific moment in that specific year, were exactly what the man at the bank in Iowa Falls was going to be looking at in June when he decided whether the Reed family's operating note was a good investment for another year. Harold understood all of that, without Thomas needing to say it, because Harold had understood the arithmetic of a farming operation for 30 years. What Thomas heard in the 4 seconds of silence was his father doing the calculation he'd already done and arriving at the same place. I have the pattern. Thomas said it before he had completely decided to say it. I poured heat 17 last week. The casting's on the bench. I haven't installed it, but I bored it to spec and the flange face is clean. Another silence. 2 seconds this time. How long to get it on the machine? 4 hours to fit. Start to install. He paused. If nothing goes wrong. Harold's voice came back with the flatness of a man who has farmed for 30 years and has a specific relationship with the phrase, if nothing goes wrong. Something always goes wrong. Yes, sir. Still 4 hours. The line was quiet for 1 more second. Then come home and do it. Thomas put the manual back on the shelf exactly where it had been. He locked the shop. He drove home through the April afternoon with the radio off, and his hands on the wheel, and his mind in the granary working through the sequence, furnace charge, pour temperature, gating system, cooling time, extraction, then the school, bore, face, drill, tap, clean, fit, which was the sequence he had run enough times now to know where it would try to surprise him and what to do when it did. Would you treat them with kindness? He pulled into the drive. Harold was already at the granary door, not waiting in the dramatic sense. Harold did not do dramatic. He was there because the granary was where the relevant thing was happening, and he was a man who went to where the relevant thing was happening. Thomas got out of the truck. Harold spoke without preamble, the way a man speaks when preamble would cost time he doesn't have. What do you need? An hour to charge and heat the furnace. Then the pour, 3 hours on the lathe. Terry's in the house. Rule 2. No fire without a person over 18 in the house. Thomas had forgotten Rule 2 for approximately 40 seconds during the drive home, which was the amount of time it had taken for the practical urgency to push the framework briefly aside. It came back now, with the specific weight of a promise, which is heavier than a rule because a rule you follow because someone is watching, and a promise you keep because of who you are. I'll get him. He went inside. Would you treat them with kindness? Terry was at the kitchen table with a homework assignment he had been ignoring for what looked like several days based on the condition of the paper. Terry was 18 and had his father's build, and his mother's eyes and a quality of physical energy that had not yet found its full channel, which made him simultaneously useful and unpredictable. Thomas told him what was happening. Terry closed the homework with a relief that suggested the hydraulic crisis was genuinely welcome. Lorraine was in the kitchen. She looked at Thomas when he came in, and she looked at the coat he was already wearing and the keys still in his hand, and she read the situation the way she read most situations, completely and without being told. How long? 4 hours. Probably 5. She looked at him. Vanessa's working until 9, I know. She nodded once. Which meant she understood the whole of it, the timeline, the pressure. Would you treat them with kindness? The thing that had to happen tonight because the calendar said tonight was the night when it had to happen. She turned back to the counter. She was going to be in the house, which was rule 2, satisfied. Which was a thing neither of them said out loud, because saying it out loud would have made it smaller. Thomas went back to the granary and charged the furnace at 5 o'clock with coke and broken engine block from the pile he'd been accumulating. He ran the blower, he watched the charge settle and the coke catch and the temperature begin to climb. The color treat them with kindness. The color inside the charge chamber moved toward the particular orange-white that sits at the edge of the visible spectrum and means the iron is ready. Terry Coleman managed the sand buckets with the focused seriousness of someone who had been assigned a specific role in something real and understood that the role was real. He stood near the wall and he watched and he did not fidget, which, for Terry, was significant. Thomas made 2 molds, not 1. This was the decision that the February version of him would not have made. In February, he would have made 1 mold and believed in it, because in February, he had not yet failed enough times to understand what the word enough means when applied to insurance. By April, he had learned a specific and non-transferable truth, that the poor does not care how much you need it to work, and a backup mold, packed and ready, costs 2 hours of work and saves a night of starting over, and the 2 hours of work are always worth it. He packed the first mold and checked the moisture with the squeeze test Kenneth had described. Packed the second, checked it, set both in position. The setup took 43 minutes. He had gotten faster at this without noticing he was getting faster, which is the way real skill accumulates, not in the moments when you are trying to improve, but in the accumulated weight of every previous tremendous attempt expressing itself thrown as minds on end without consulting your conscious mind. By 6:15, the furnace was running at temperature. The iron charge had reached the color that sits between orange and white without quite being either, which is the color that means now, not soon, not almost now. He tapped the furnace. The iron came out in the stream that still, even on heat 18, still sent a charge of pure animal attention through his chest. Not fear. Something adjacent to fear that was actually more like respect. The respect you feel in the presence of something that will not make accommodations. He poured the first mold in one continuous motion, fast, the count running in his head, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, not rushing the count but not letting it slow either. And the iron filled, and the gas vented through the risers, in the small flickers of flame he had learned to read as correctly, and he went immediately to the second mold and repeated the motion. Then he set the ladle down and stepped back and felt the heat coming off both molds and the furnace and the concrete floor that had absorbed a season's worth of heat and now gave it back. 45 minutes to cool. He went inside and ate what was in the pan on the stove, which was something Lorraine had left warm without making an announcement about it, because that was how Lorraine handled the logistics of a house where something important was happening. Terry came in and ate standing up and went back out. Harold sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and did not make conversation, which was correct. Thomas went back to the granary at 7:30. He cracked the first mold with kindness. He cracked the first mold with a hammer and held his breath in the specific way you hold your breath when you have run 17 previous heats toward this moment, and the moment is finally here, and you have done everything you know how to do, and the iron is either going to be right or it isn't. There was a gas hole in the flange, small, approximately the size of a pea, located on the mounting face, directly beneath where the primary bolt had to clamp. The one location on the entire casting where a defect of any size was catastrophic. He looked at it for 4 seconds. 4 specific seconds in which the option of despair was available, and he let it be available and then set it aside. Because it was available, but it was not useful. He set the casting down. He picked up the hammer. He walked to the second mold. Behind him, Harold Reed came through the granary door. He had come out without Thomas seeing him come across the yard. He stood just inside the doorway. and watched Thomas position the hammer at the parting line of the second mold. Lorraine had stayed in the house, which was Rule 2 satisfied. Harold was here, which was something else. Not Rule 2. Something that didn't have a rule number. Thomas struck the mold. The cope lifted. The drag separated. He pulled the casting free from the sand and brushed it off with a gloved hand and held it under the work light. Clean. He ran his thumb across the mounting face. No voids he could feel. He checked the outlet port geometry against the caliper setting he'd already adjusted for the bore he knew he was going to cut. The wall thickness on the pressure side was within the range he'd targeted. The casting was, by every check he could perform in a granary at 7:40 on an April evening, a hydraulic pump housing for a John Deere 4240. He looked at Harold. Harold looked at the casting. Would you treat them with kindness? Neither of them said anything for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, and exactly as long as it needed to be. Then Thomas picked up his coat, and the casting and the calipers, and drove to the vocational school. The side door was unlocked. The shop was dark except for the safety light over the exit. Would you treat them with kindness? He turned on the work lights over the lathe and set the casting in the chuck and touched off the bore with an indicator and found it where the pattern had put it, which was where he needed it to be. He ran the bore to dimension in 2 passes, a roughing cut and a finishing cut, measuring between passes with a bore gauge. The dimension came to within a 0.5 of the nominal. He milled the mounting face flat and checked it with a surface plate indicator and found it within 0.02 end to end, which for a pump housing mounting face is within the zone where a good gasket handles the rest. He drilled the bolt holes on the drill press, using the cracked original housing as his template for hole location, tapped them, and blew the chips out with compressed air. He pulled the casting from the chuck and set it on the bench and looked at it under the work light. It was a part, not a shape, a part, a thing that could be installed on a machine and do the work it was designed to do. Timothy Clark was in the shop office, with the door open and the light on, and a book in his hands. He had not looked up from the book since Thomas had arrived. He did not look up now. The light in the office stayed on until 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock it went off. Thomas was already out the side door. He drove home under a sky that had cleared to the specific black and star-heavy condition that Iowa produces in April after the clouds move east, the kind of sky that makes the flat land seem even flatter. By contrast, the land running away in every direction toward a horizon that was visible even at night because the stars were that clear. Harold was in the equipment shed when Thomas pulled in, standing beside the 4240, with a work light on a cord hung from the ceiling beam. He had pulled the tractor out of the line. He had the cracked housing already removed from the machine, sitting on the workbench in its brackets, the hydraulic lines capped and the area cleaned. He had done all of this preparation while Thomas was at the school, not because treat them with kindness. Not because Thomas had asked him to, because it was the logical sequence of events and Harold was a man who followed the logical sequence without needing to be walked through it. Thomas carried the new housing to the bench. He set it next to the cracked one and looked at both of them for a moment, the old and the new, the broken and the whole. Would you treat them with kindness? Then he installed the new housing into the brackets, seated it against the pump body, and torqued the bolts in the cross pattern to the spec from the service manual he had memorized 3 weeks prior. He cut a new gasket from sheet stock and seated it on the mounting face. Harold held the work light without being asked. He angled it where Thomas needed it without being told, which is the particular skill of someone who has worked alongside machines long enough to read the work, rather than the person doing it. Thomas torqued the mounting bolts in 2 stages. Snug first, then to spec, cross pattern, the way the manual specified. He connected the hydraulic lines. He checked the fittings. He stood up. Started. Harold started the tractor. The engine came up to idle, and the hydraulic pump engaged and the pressure built in the system. And Thomas put his eyes on the mounting face and the line fittings and every connection he'd made in the last 20 minutes. A thin line of oil appeared at the base of the mounting flange. Not a drip, a film. The kind of film that catches the work light and shows itself as a slow migration of oil. From somewhere it was supposed to be contained to somewhere it wasn't. Harold saw it too. Vanessa, who had come home from her shift sometime in the last hour, and was standing in the equipment shed doorway with her coat still on and her notebook in her hand, saw it too. She didn't write anything. Terry, standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, the posture of someone performing calm they were not entirely feeling, went very still. The oil film ran slowly down the side of the casting. Gathered at the lower corner. Did not drip. 90 seconds. Thomas stood in the light with kindness. Thomas stood in the light from the work lamp and watched oil migrate across the surface of a casting he had poured in a granary, from a pattern he had carved from basswood and machined on a borrowed lathe and installed with his father holding the light. And he watched it for 90 seconds, which is a very long time, when what you are watching is something you built failing in front of your family. Then he crouched down and put his thumb against where the housing met the joint, where the housing met the pump body. He understood immediately. It was not the casting. He knew it was not the castings, because he had bored the register to dimension himself and measured it twice, and the dimension was correct. It was the mating face on the pump body. He had milled the housing face flat and checked it with an indicator. But the pump body's mating face had surface roughness from years of service, small irregularities, that a new gasket seats against if everything is perfect, but that will roll the gasket if the clamp load is insufficient or if there is any contamination on the face. He had cleaned the housing face. He had not cleaned the pump body face, because the pump body was not something he had thought to include in the sequence. It was a thing he knew to do and had not done. He stood up. Shut it off. Give me 20 minutes. Harold shut the tractor down. Thomas pulled the housing. He took a flat file and a straight edge, and he scraped the mating face on the pump body to remove the oxidation and service residue that had built up over 14 years of operation, working the file in overlapping strokes and checking with the straight edge after every 4 or 5 passes until the blade lay flat with no light showing under it. Then he cleaned both faces with a rag. He cut a new gasket from clean sheet stock. He reinstalled the housing, torquing the bolts in the cross pattern again, snug then spec, checking the sequence. 22 minutes. Harold started the tractor for the second time. The system came to pressure. Thomas put his eyes on the mounting face, on the line fittings, on every connection, on the gasket line where the housing met the pump body. Nothing moved, no film, no migration. No gathering at the lower corner. The oil stayed inside the system, where oil in a hydraulic system is supposed to stay, which is to say inside it, under pressure, doing the work it was put there to do. Harold stood with the work light hanging at his side and the engine running and the hydraulics cycling as he moved the loader joystick to confirm pressure and response. The loader rose. The loader lowered. The system responded the way a hydraulic system responds when it is whole. Harold let the loader settle. He cut the engine. The equipment shed went quiet except for the ticking of the engine cooling and the distant sound of the April night outside. What did it cost? Thomas looked at the ceiling for a moment. $11.40. He paused. The iron was free. Harold was quiet. He looked at the tractor. He looked past it at the granary door visible through the equipment shed window, the work light still on inside, the thin line of smoke from the furnace cooling drifting across the yard in the dark. One dealer wanted $390. Yes, sir. Harold reached over and put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Not a pat, not a gesture. A hand placed deliberately on a shoulder with a weight behind it that was not about the shoulder. You were right. Quiet, direct. The way that man said everything that mattered. Not dressed up. Not softened. Just accurate. Thomas looked at the workbench for a moment. Then at his father's hand. Then at the tractor, which was whole. They planted on schedule. The first week of June, Harold drove to Iowa Falls and sat across the desk from the loan officer who ran his eyes down a column of figures and renewed the note for another year in 11 minutes. The hydraulic pump housing was not mentioned. The man at the bank did not know that the reason the crop had gone in on time was an $11 casting poured in a grain shed at 5 in the afternoon. He did not know about the 11 days it had taken Harold to answer. He did not know about the borrowed lathe, or the broken clevis, or the $2.50 receipt taped to the inside cover of a composition book. He knew that the yield projections looked solid, and the operating note was a reasonable risk for another year. That was sufficient. By the end of that growing season, 3 neighbors had brought broken castings to the granary and left with replacements. Earl from the farm 2 miles east, whose water pump cover had cracked in June. The Hendersons, whose belt idler had shattered against a rock strike in July. Would you treat them with kindness? A man named Patterson from the north end of the county who had heard about the pump housing from someone who had heard about it from someone else and drove over one Saturday with a cracked drawbar yoke and a hopeful expression. Thomas priced all 3 at 30% of the dealer rate. Not because he was generous. He was not in the business of generosity. He was in the business of solving a problem. Pricing near the dealer, and he was just a slower dealer without a warranty. Pricing near cost, and every farmer in the county would assume the parts were worth what he charged, which was nothing, and bring him their lowest confidence problems. 30% was the number where a man saved real money and still believed he had paid for something with substance behind it. Vanessa wrote every transaction in the book. She had expanded the column structure by then. A column for materials, a column for labor hours, a column for the dealer equivalent price, and the margin column that she had started on her own in April. Would you treat them with kindness? She had started a separate ledger for what she was beginning to call the second business, which was the one that served customers who weren't the Reed family. Would you treat them with kindness? And she kept it with the precision of someone who understood that in the absence of formal documentation, a business is just a hobby with ambitions. By the spring of 1988, there were 9 customers. By the fall of 988, 16, and a waiting list written in chalk on the granary wall, because the notebook was getting full and the wall was right there. And then the letter arrived. It came in the October mail, in an envelope from the insurance company that carried the farm policy. The language was formal and referenced a structural inspection and potential liability concerns associated with industrial operations on agricultural property. 2 days after the letter, the phone rang, and a man from the county fire marshal's office asked Harold specific questions about a granary on the property and whether it was being used for purposes other than grain storage. Harold answered the questions. He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a moment. Then he called Thomas. Thomas drove over. He read the letter. He sat with it for a while in the way he sat with problems that had multiple dimensions, not rushing toward the first solution, but mapping the shape of the problem first. It was clear that someone had made a report. The fire marshal had been out, or someone had been out, and they had seen one thing and only one thing: a char mark on a corner post the size of a dinner plate. The kind of mark a fire makes when it is stopped immediately rather than allowed to develop. The kind of mark that sits at the boundary between an incident that was handled and an incident that was not. Vanessa read the letter twice without expression. Would you treat them with kindness? Then she asked the question that turned out to be the correct one, not whether they were in trouble, but what would make this stop being a problem. Thomas thought about it for 2 days. He had $60 in the coffee can above the stove. He drove into Eldora on a Thursday morning and walked into the office of a man named Stephen Scott, who was 47 years old and had practiced law in Eldora for 19 years out of an office above the hardware store, and had the specific quality of competence that accumulates in a person who has handled the real problems of real people in a small county for a long time without the luxury of specialization. He told Stephen Scott everything: the foundry, the customers, the letter, the phone call, the char mark on the post. He showed him the composition books, the heat log, the supplier receipts, the customer ledger Vanessa had been keeping. Stephen Scott listened to all of it without interrupting. He looked at the books. He looked at the heat log specifically for a long time. Then he leaned back in his chair. You cannot stop a man from filing a complaint. What you can do is make the paperwork ruin his day when he tries to act on it. He said 3 things. First, the operation needed to be registered as a business, which cost $15 at the county clerk's office. and converted the activity from informal to formal in the eyes of any regulatory body that cared to look. First visit, first question. You hand them the registration certificate and the nature of the inquiry changes. Second, the fire marshal's concern was not the furnace, which was legal, but the building classification, which needed to be documented as appropriate for the use. An inspection from a licensed inspector, passed with current equipment in place, created a record that was its own defense against future complaints. Third, and this was the one Thomas had already done without knowing why he was doing it, the test bars. Since the previous summer, Thomas had been cutting a small test bar from the runner system of each heat and mailing it to a metallurgical testing lab in Iowa for composition and tensile strength analysis. $4 a sample. Would you treat them with kindness? He had done it first because he wanted to know whether the iron he was pouring was actually as good as it needed to be, and then because the results had started coming back showing it was, and then because he had gotten into the habit of wanting things confirmed in writing. He had a binder of test results 2 inches thick. Stephen Scott looked at the binder. He turned a few pages. He set it down. The people who laughed at you have less documentation on their operations than you have on a single casting. He charged Thomas $40 for the consultation and told him to come back if anything escalated. Thomas registered the business that same afternoon. Reed Family Agricultural Castings. Filed at the county clerk's office at 2:15 on a Thursday with $15 and the form Stephen Scott had outlined for him. The clerk stamped it and handed him his copy, and that was that. A business that had been running for 8 months became, at 2:15 on a Thursday in Eldora, a legal entity with a name and a registration number. The insurance company did not write again. The fire marshal's office did not call again. Whoever had made the report had made it into a system that had now been outpaced by paperwork. Which would you treat them with kindness? Which was what Stephen Scott had told him would happen, and what Thomas had suspected was true before he walked into the office. Which was why he had walked into the office instead of waiting to see what would develop. The November after the letter, the phone in the Reed kitchen rang on a Tuesday evening. Harold answered. He came to find Thomas in the granary. "Ronald Sanchez wants to talk to you." Thomas wiped his hands and went to the phone. Ronald Sanchez was not a man who expressed things in unnecessary ways. He had been behind the parts counter for 19 years, and he had learned to communicate in the specific register of a man who deals in inventory, which is to say, he communicated about what was available and what it cost and when it could be there. Apology was not part of the inventory. He told Thomas he had a pallet of returned cores in the back of the shop, factory castings too damaged for rebuild credit, scheduled to be shipped back to the manufacturer. 43 pieces. Different components, every one of them carrying original factory dimensions. He was writing them off as scrap. Thomas could have them for nothing. Both men understood what was happening. It was not a favor. A favor implies a social debt that the giver can call in. This was a transaction in which the currency was access. Kenneth's cores for Thomas's capability, and the transaction was clean because both parties knew exactly what they were getting. That was why it worked. Ambiguity is where arrangements go to die. Ronald said one more thing before he hung up, in the flat register of a man discussing precipitation. His grandfather had been a blacksmith in western Iowa, had made parts for 30 years, agricultural components, the kind of thing that kept small operations running. Stopped when the dealerships got big enough that it seemed to stop making sense. Sold the forge. Retired. Ronald paused. He wasn't sure now that it had ever actually stopped making sense. He thought maybe people had just stopped paying attention. He hung up without waiting for a response. Thomas stood with the phone in his hand for a moment. Would you treat them with kindness? Then he went back out to the granary and stood at the bench and looked at the binder of test results and the shelf of patterns and the chalk list on the wall that had outgrown 2 successive areas of wall as the customer count had grown, and he understood something, that the individual heats and the individual customers and the individual transactions had been building toward without him having named it yet. This was not a side project. This was a business, a real one, with real customers and real documentation. and a registered name and a binder of metallurgical data that was better than anything the dealership had on the components it was selling at 3 and 4 times his price. It was a business that was solving a real problem in a real county for real people, and it was going to keep growing because the problem it was solving was not going away. He picked up the chalk and found an empty space on the wall and wrote the date, and below it wrote 43 beside an arrow he drew pointing to the shelf where he was going to put the cores when he picked them up on Thursday. Then he went back to the furnace. There was heat 19 to run. George White came back in the fall of 1990, 3.5 years after the Tuesday morning at the parts counter. 3.5 years after the 2-second silence, and the laughter, and the easy lean against the counter, and the words that had the specific weight of a man who has never had to justify an opinion in his life. 3.5 years. Long enough that Thomas had moved the operation out of the granary and into a rented implement shop on the south edge of Eldora. Concrete floor and 3-phase power, 2 furnaces now instead of 1. 8 regular customers and a waiting list that no longer fit on any available wall. George White drove up on a Thursday afternoon. No phone call. Alone. He stood in the doorway of the implement shop for a moment before he came in. He had a cracked transmission housing for an Alice Chalmers 7080 under his arm. A big casting. A complicated one. The kind of casting with multiple internal cavities and a precision register on the input shaft bore and a mounting face that has to be dead flat, because the transmission bolts directly to the engine block and any deviation in that interface produces vibration that destroys both. The kind of treat them with kindness. The kind of cast him north of $500 at the parts counter. Thomas looked up from the furnace and waited. He had known this was eventually coming. Not George White specifically, but the version of George White that exists in every county in Iowa. The man who laughed first and loudest, the man who held court at the counter, the man who got it wrong in public and had to find a way to walk it back without making Wong the walking back into its own kind of performance. He had known the version of that conversation was eventually going to happen. He had not rushed it. George White stood inside the doorway with the housing in both hands, and he looked at Thomas across the floor of the implement shop, and he did something that a man with 800 acres and 19 years of parts counter authority does not do easily. He said, "I was wrong about you." 4 words. No elaboration. No qualification. No story about why he had been wrong or what he had subsequently learned or how he now understood things differently. Just the 4 words, placed carefully in the space between them, like something that had been carried a long way and needed to be set down. Thomas crossed the floor. He took the housing from George White's hands. He set it on the bench. He ran a tape measure across the register bore and checked the parting line geometry and looked at the fracture pattern in the wall, which told him the history of the stress that had cracked it, a torsional overload event, probably a hard engagement, probably in the fall somewhere. He set the tape down. "Come back Thursday." George White nodded. He looked at the bench. Would you treat them with kindness? He looked at the second furnace, which had come from a shuttered foundry in Iowa and was 5 the capacity of the pipe and fire clay setup in the granary. He looked at the chalkboard on the wall, which was the old chalkboard from the granary, the one that had carried the original customer list, brought to the implement shop when Thomas moved the operation, because some things travel with a business even when they have outlived their original function. It now listed the vacation schedule for the 8 employees. George White looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he turned and walked out. The housing cost him $62. The dealer price was $540. He came back the following month with an idler bracket from a combine, and the month after that with a PTO coupler housing. He never came back to the parts counter in Eldora and held court about Thomas Jackson. And when farmers asked him, as farmers in that county eventually asked everyone about everything, what he knew about the foundry on the south side of town, he said 4 words of a different kind. Go see him yourself. No decoration, no story, no performance of a changed mind. Just a direction. In a county that size, a man like George White pointing someone toward a business is worth more than any print advertisement. It is worth more than a listing in any directory. It is worth more than a sign on the road. Because when George White says go see him, the people who hear it know what it costs George White to say it, and they go. 16 customers became 31. 31 became 62. By the spring of 1989, Thomas had graduated and decided against college, which was the subject of exactly one conversation with Harold. 4 minutes. It ended with Harold saying he expected his son knew what he was doing, which was a statement and a permission and a challenge, all three. And Thomas took all three and went back to the foundry. He spent $4,000 of the accumulated business revenue on a second furnace from a shuttered operation in Iowa, a gray iron foundry that had closed in 1979 and left its equipment to sit in a building until someone came along who needed it. He asked Kenneth Lee to come look it over before he committed the money. Kenneth came on a Wednesday. He walked into the empty building where the foundry had operated. He walked the length of it once, slowly. He stood at the shell of the second furnace, the one Thomas wanted to buy, and he put his palm flat against its side and held it there for a moment, the way you hold your hand against something you want to read through the skin. It's sound, Kenneth said. Buy it. Thomas bought it. He thought, standing in that building with Kenneth, would you treat them with kindness? About what it meant to be in a place where 12 years of someone's life had happened and none of it was visible anymore except for the shape on the floor where the pouring line had been. A building full of decisions and knowledge and the specific education that only comes from doing a thing badly first, and then better, and then well, and all of it was gone except for the equipment, and the equipment was going to be useful in a way the building could no longer be. He moved it to the implement shop in Eldora. He filed the business name that April, Reed Family Agricultural Castings. He had been thinking about it for 2 years. It said exactly what the business did without surplus. He hired Vanessa, formally, as office manager, with a salary and a title and a desk that was better than the kitchen table she had been using. She accepted with the specific composure of someone formalizing an arrangement that both parties had understood for quite some time. The chalk list of customers had long since outgrown the wall. By the end of 1988, Vanessa had finished the year-end reconciliation and added both columns and set the total in front of Harold at the kitchen table without preamble. $14,700. $14,700. $14,700 that had stayed in Hardin County instead of leaving it. That had stayed in the hands of the farmers who had earned it instead of moving to a manufacturer's accounts receivable column. That number represented parts Harold had not paid dealer price for. Parts the 9 original customers had not paid dealer price for. Parts the 16 and then the 31 had not paid dealer price for. Harold looked at the number. He read it the way he read everything that mattered from the beginning, carefully, without hurrying. Then he read it again. Then he set the paper down and looked at the table. Then he sat down in the chair, which he had not done yet, because he had been standing when Vanessa handed him the paper. The sitting down was involuntary, the kind of involuntary that happens when a number is big enough to require a person to redistribute their weight. Vanessa watched him. She did not say anything. She was 21 years old, and she had spent the last 2 years building an accounting system from scratch for a business that had not existed, and she had an opinion, which she kept to herself, about what the number meant and where it was going. She was going to let it mean what it meant to Harold first, which was the correct instinct, and she had it naturally, which was why the business needed her in the chair she was in. Harold looked at the number for a long time. Your grandfather would have. He stopped. Started again. He would have wanted to see this. He did not say which grandfather. He did not need to. The fire happened on the 9th of June. Thomas had been running Heat 23, a drawbar yoke for Earl's combine. A part he had poured them with kindness. A part he had poured 3 times before and knew the gating system for well enough that he had stopped writing the setup notes on a separate sheet and just ran it from memory. This was probably the first mistake. Probably the first mistake. Not the memory itself, which was accurate, but the assumption that accuracy in memory is sufficient protection against the variable that memory does not store, which is the specific position of a man's hands when the ladle is full, and the pour is already in motion, and his left grip shifts by half an inch on the handle. A cup of iron, maybe slightly more. Over the lip of the ladle, off the rim, onto the base of the corner post 3 feet to his left. 56-year-old oak does not smolder. It announces itself. The flame was at the base of the post, and climbing toward the first horizontal member before Thomas had set the ladle down. He had 2 steps to the sand bucket. He had put the sand bucket exactly there in April, not because he had anticipated this specific failure mode, but because he had sat in the granary one evening in April and thought seriously about what could go wrong, and where a bucket needed to be relative to every surface that could catch. Would you treat them with kindness? And he had moved the bucket from where it had been to where it needed to be, and the distance between those 2 positions was approximately 4 feet, and those 4 feet were the reason the fire went out in under a minute instead of going somewhere else entirely. He swept the sand into the char with a shovel. He checked the post. He checked the floor. He checked the adjacent wall. He stood in the granaries, with the smell of burned oak and hot metal around him, and his heart conducting its own investigation of the situation independent of the rest of him. And when it finished its investigation and came back with a report that the incident was contained, he picked up the ladle and finished pouring heat 23. The casting came out clean. He put heat 23 in Vanessa's book with the rest of them. Materials cost, poor time. Result: 1 drawbar yoke, serviceable. He did not add a line about the fire because the fire was not part of the heat log. The fire was a separate matter that he had not yet decided how to handle. The char mark on the post was approximately the size of a dinner plate, running from the base up about 18 inches. Dark black against the oak. Definitive. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned off the work light and walked to the house and went to sleep. 6 days passed. In those 6 days, Thomas ran 2 more heats, delivered parts to 2 customers, drove to the vocational school twice for machining, ate 4 meals with his family, and did not say a word about the fire to anyone. Not to Harold. Not to Lorraine. Not to Vanessa, who had been updating the accounts ledger at the kitchen table on Tuesday evening 3 feet from where he was sitting, and who had looked at him twice in the specific way she looked at things she was deciding whether to count. He did not say a word to Terry Coleman either, which was where the plan had its fundamental flaw. Terry was 18. Would you treat them with kindness? He was enthusiastic about his role in the foundry operation, which had evolved from holding the ladder and watching the sand buckets to occasionally running the blower controls, and sometimes helping with the flask setup, all of which had given him a sense of participation in something real that he was not inclined to relinquish. Would you treat them with kindness? He had also been standing approximately 12 feet from the corner post when the iron spilled, which meant he had watched the whole thing from strike to suppression, and he had kept the secret for 6 days with the full commitment of someone who understood what was at stake. And then at Sunday dinner, in the middle of a sentence about something Terry himself would not later be able to fully reconstruct, the information simply came out, not as a confession, not as a report, more as a conversational turn that took an unexpected route through territory he had not intended to visit. The table went quiet. Lorraine set her fork down. Harold looked at Terry for 1 second, the look of a man confirming that he has heard correctly, and then he looked at Thomas, and Thomas looked at his plate. Harold stood up. He walked out to the granary. Thomas followed. Neither of them spoke crossing the yard. Harold stood in front of the char mark and looked at it. He did not touch it. He looked at it the way a man looks at evidence, which is to say, without the expression he is going to have once he has finished looking and begins to respond. Just looking first. The post was intact. The fire had not reached the first horizontal member. The granary was standing exactly as it had been standing since 1931, which was to say without any structural compromise. These were facts, and they were also not the point. 6 days. Harold's voice was even, not loud. Even Thomas stood beside him. Yes, sir. You gave me your word about this building. I gave you my word I wouldn't burn it down. Thomas heard how that sounded the moment it left his mouth, and he did not take it back. because it was accurate. The bucket was there in April. I put it there before it happened, not after. Harold turned and looked at the room. He had not been in the granary since the operation had expanded. What he saw was not the operation he had visited in March of 1987. Would you treat them with kindness? The corner post with the char mark was real, and it was there, and it was the thing that had precipitated this conversation. But the rest of the room held things that had not been there when he gave the rope, and was not expecting what the rope would build. A steel splash shield bolted to the concrete floor between the furnace and the near wall. Fabricated from 3/4 plate welded corners, no gaps at the floor line. 2 sand buckets, not one, positioned on opposite sides of the pour area. A wet burlap sack on a nail beside the door. The floor itself swept clean and dry in the working radius. A clear path from the furnace to the exterior door, with nothing in it, no scrap, no tools, no pallets, nothing that would slow a man down if the situation required him to move fast. None of it had been in the numbers Thomas had shown Harold in February. None of it had been asked for. All of it was the consequence of a person spending a significant number of evenings thinking hard about exactly this category of event. Harold stood with his back to Thomas and looked at those things. Thomas waited. The granary was quiet. Outside, the June evening was doing the thing Iowa evenings do in early summer when the air is warm, and the fields are in, and the light is still good at 8 o'clock, sitting on the yard like something that intends to stay. Harold turned around. Next time something happens, I hear about it that night. Yes, sir. That was the whole of it. No additional conditions. No revision to the operating terms. Just the one new requirement, which was reasonable and which Thomas had been expecting in some form since the moment the iron spilled. He drove into town the following morning and bought a fire extinguisher from the hardware store. A good one. ABC rated, £10 charge, the kind with the metal valve housing, rather than the plastic one. He brought it to the granary and mounted it on the wall, beside the door, where a person exiting in a hurry would not miss it, and a person working at the furnace could reach it in 3 steps. Harold saw it when he came out to check the fuel lines on the combine that afternoon. He looked at it on the wall. He said nothing about it. He went back to the combine. The extinguisher stayed on the wall. Word traveled through Hardin County the way everything travels through a county that size. Not fast, not loud, finding the low ground and following it until it reaches everywhere. The first man who came asking had heard something from someone who had heard something from Earl, whose drawbar yoke had been in service for 2 months and had not given him any cause for complaint. He drove in on a Saturday with a cracked PTO shaft housing in the bed of his truck. Thomas looked at it. He knew he could pour it. He had been pouring in that family of geometry for months. He was reasonably confident, standing at the tailgate looking at the housing, that he could pour it well. He pushed the housing back across the tailgate. I can't take that one. The man's expression ran through a sequence. Surprise. Confusion. Something harder and colder at the end of the sequence. Word is you're doing this now. I am. Just not that. Thomas put his hand flat on the tailgate. Not aggressive. Definitive. Anything that spins at PTO speed, I don't touch. That's not my rule specifically, but it's a good one and I'm keeping it. The man argued for about a minute. His tone shifted from confused to annoyed and from annoyed to cold. He had driven out on a Saturday. He had expected a solution and he was leaving without one. He drove out of the yard without another word. Vanessa, who had been watching from the granary doorway, made a note in the ledger, with a dash where the revenue number would have been, and the word declined written in the margin. She had started annotating declines. Would you treat them with kindness? She had a theory about what the pattern of declines said about how the business should be positioned, and she was accumulating evidence for the theory before she presented it. That first refusal cost Thomas the first money anyone had ever offered him for his work, which was $100 he watched drive away in a pickup truck on a Saturday afternoon. He stood at the edge of the yard until the truck reached the county road and turned north. Then he went back to the granary. The waiting list on the wall had 9 names. He picked up the chalk. The summer of 1988 brought 31 customers. The fall brought 47. By the time the November letter arrived from the insurance company, the operation had a registered name, a binder of metallurgical test results that Stephen Scott had called better documentation than most operations, 3 times its size, a concrete floor where the dirt one had been, and a second furnace still being negotiated. The char mark on the corner post had not been painted over or sanded. It was still there, 18 inches of dark oak in the corner of the granary, and Thomas had made a deliberate decision to leave it. Not because he was proud of the fire. He was not proud of the fire. He left it because the fire was part of the record, and erasing it from the post would have been the same kind of dishonesty as not writing a failed heat in the log, which was the one thing he had never done. The record had to be complete or it was not a record. It was just a story you were telling yourself. By 1990, Reed Family Agricultural Castings had moved to the implement shop on the south edge of Eldora. Concrete floors, 3-phase power, a second furnace, purchased from the Iowa operation Kenneth had approved, which would you treat them with kindness? Installed beside the first one in a configuration that doubled the throughput and allowed Thomas to run overlapping heats on large orders without the bottleneck that had started to develop in the fall of 1989 when demand exceeded what one furnace could produce in a working day. He had hired his first employee in the spring of 1989, a man named Davis from west of town, who had worked in a machine shop in Ames for 11 years and had moved back to Hardin County when his parents' health required it and needed work that was within driving distance of a situation that needed him close. Would you treat them with kindness? Thomas had interviewed him for 40 minutes, most of which was Thomas watching Davis look at the equipment and listening to the questions Davis asked. Would you treat them with kindness? Because the questions a machinist asks about an unfamiliar setup tell you more about the machinist than the answers to any question you could put to him directly. Davis asked about the bore tolerances on the hydraulic housings. He asked about the heat treatment protocol. He asked whether Thomas was using pyrometer readings or color to determine pour temperature, and when Thomas said both, Davis had nodded the specific nod of someone confirming a suspicion they had going in. Thomas hired him. By 1990, there were 4 employees. By 1992, 7. Would you treat them with kindness? By the time George White walked through the door with the Alice Chalmers housing in the fall of 1990, would you treat them with kindness? The operation had long since outgrown anything that could be described as a side project, or a supplementary income, or any of the other diminishing phrases that the county had used in its early characterization of what was happening on the south edge of town. It was a business. Real customers, real revenue, real documentation. Real employees drawing real paychecks. The kind of business that shows up in the county tax records and the Secretary of State's filings and the books at the Iowa Falls Bank, where, by 1991, Reed Family Agricultural Castings had its own commercial account separate from the farm operating account, because the farm and the business had become 2 distinct financial entities that happened to share a family. Kenneth Lee came to the implement shop in the winter of 1991. He was 75 years old by then, and the oxygen bottle traveled with him on a strap over his shoulder, and his pace had changed from the deliberate pace of a working man to the measured pace of a man who has negotiated with his body and arrived at terms. He came not because Thomas had asked him, but because he wanted to see it. Thomas gave him the full tour. The furnaces, the pattern library, which occupied 3 full shelving units along the east wall and contained over 60 patterns in various states of maintenance. The machine shop section, with the 3 lathes and the mill and the drill press and the surface grinder. The testing station where the bar samples were still being cut and mailed to the Iowa lab, every heat, without exception, because Thomas had never stopped the practice that had started as self-assessment and become documentation, and had finally become the architecture of the business's credibility. Kenneth walked through the whole of it, slowly. He stopped at the furnaces. He put his hand on the second furnace, the one he had approved in the empty building, and held it there the same way he had held it then. Sound, he said. Still is, Thomas said. Kenneth looked at the pattern shelves. He looked at the test station. He looked at Davis at the lathe and the two other men working at the flask setup for the afternoon pour. He looked at all of it. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man adding a column of figures that has been running for several years and has now reached a sum he can assess. He didn't say what the sum was. He didn't need to. He put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, the same gesture Harold had used in the equipment shed 4 years prior. The gesture that means something was done correctly, and the correct thing to say is this, not words, just the weight of a hand placed with intention. He went home. He died in 1996, in March, which was the month Thomas had first dragged blocks out of his pile without asking. The obituary in the Eldora paper ran 2 paragraphs and mentioned the machine shop and his family and his years in Hardin County. It did not mention with kindness. It did not mention Waterloo. It did not mention the 12 years on the pouring floor or the things he had told a young man standing in his shop with a broken casting in his coat pocket. The knowledge had been passed, and the passing was what mattered, and the obituary was about other things. Thomas went to the service. He sat in the 3rd row. He stayed for an hour afterward at the gathering at the family's house, and before he left he told Kenneth's daughter, a woman named Sandra, who had her father's quality of direct attention and her mother's way of listening with her whole face, that her father had told him 3 things in a Saturday morning. Conversation that had changed the shape of his understanding of his work, and that the business Thomas had built was in some part built on those 3 things. Sandra looked at him. He never told us about Waterloo. I know. She thought about that. He wouldn't have wanted a fuss. No, Thomas said. He wouldn't. He drove back to Eldora and ran 2 heats that afternoon and wrote them up in the log and went home. He sat at the kitchen table, in the house he had bought, in 1990, 3 blocks from the implement shop. And he thought about what it means to carry knowledge that was paid for by someone else's years. The 12 years of silicandness, the 12 years of silica dust that Kenneth Lee had breathed in a Waterloo foundry before a doctor told him to stop, had purchased an education that Kenneth had carried for 28 years without a context for it. Would you treat them with kindness? And then one Saturday morning the context had walked into his shop with a broken casting in a coat pocket, and he had opened the drawer and given it away without making a production of it. That was its own kind of accounting, the kind that doesn't appear in Vanessa's ledgers. In 1994, the Iowa Farm Bureau asked Thomas to speak at their annual meeting in Des Moines. He had not asked to be invited. A field representative, the organization had driven out to the implement shop on a Thursday in February to look at the operation, the kind of visit that happens when a report circulates long enough to reach someone with a platform and the inclination to amplify what it describes. Would you treat them with kindness? The representative had walked through the shop and looked at the pattern library and the test documentation and the machine setup and asked questions for 90 minutes. And 3 months later, Thomas received a letter on Farm Bureau letterhead, asking whether he would be willing to address 400 farmers at the annual meeting in October. He said yes. He wrote 2 sentences of acceptance and mailed the letter. Then he spent 6 weeks not thinking about the speech and 2 weeks thinking about nothing else. He drove to Des Moines on a Wednesday morning in October in the same truck he had driven to Kenneth's shop in March of 1987. Now 11 years old, would you treat them with kindness? With the baling wire on the back bumper that had been holding the bumper bracket since 1989 and had outlasted 2 predictions that it would eventually let go. He drove with the radio off and the window down a crack, the way he drove when he was thinking. The cold air keeping his attention sharpened to the road and the problem simultaneously. He arrived at the conference center 2 hours early. He found the room. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. 400 chairs arranged in rows. A podium at the front, an overhead projector to the right of the podium, the kind with the arm that swings out over the glass surface and projects upward to the screen behind the speaker. He had 1 slide, 1 page on the transparency, 2 columns, 23 common agricultural components, the dealer price on the left, the Reed family agricultural castings price on the right. The average gap was 63%. He went to the lobby and walked for 30 minutes. He thought about the parts counter. He thought about the 2-second silence before George White laughed. He thought about Lorraine on the porch in February, telling him twice as careful, every single time, not as a consolation, but as a strategy. The difference between those two things being the difference between a sentiment and an instruction. He thought about what she had meant by it. He thought about what she had meant by it, and what he had made of it over 7 years of applying it, and standing in the lobby of a conference center in Des Moines in October of 1994, he arrived at the understanding he had been approaching for a long time. Would you treat them with kindness? Because she thought he might fail. She had been warning him because she knew he wouldn't, and she wanted him to arrive at his success with the armor already on. The warning and the armament were the same thing. She had given him both in one sentence, because she was economical with words, the way a person is economical when they have been spending words carefully, in rooms where they were the only person of their kind for a very long time. He straightened his collar twice, in the hallway, outside the meeting room. Then he went in. The room filled over the following 30 minutes. Farmers from every county in the state. Most of them older than Thomas. Most of them white. All of them operating in the same economic structure he had first mapped in the notebooks at 17. The structure where parts were expensive, and the expense was non-negotiable, and the only thing a farmer could do about it was budget for it and pay it. Harold Reed sat in the 4th row. He had driven down from Eldora that morning, without telling anyone he was coming. He was in the good coat, the dark one he wore, to church and to the bank and to the occasions that the county marked as formal. His boots were the clean pair. He had not made an announcement. Would you treat them with kindness? He had gotten into the truck in the morning and driven to Des Moines and found the conference center and found the room and found a seat in the 4th row and sat down, and the 400 people in the room did not know who he was or why the 4th row was the correct distance from front for a man who needed to see clearly but did not want to be seen. Thomas put the slide on the overhead projector. He looked at the room. He found Harold in the 4th row, because he had been looking for Harold in the 4th row since he walked in, and Harold was where he expected him to be, which was exactly where a man like Harold would sit. He talked for 11 minutes. He did not mention the broken clevis that had come apart in his hands on heat 1. He did not mention the 90 seconds of oil migration in the equipment shed that had felt longer than 90 seconds from the inside. He did not mention the fire, the char mark, the 6 days of silence, the sand bucket that had been placed in April before the thing it was placed for had happened. He did not mention Kenneth Lee or the broken casting in the coat pocket or the 3 things said on a Saturday morning that were not in any book. He gave them the numbers, the slide, 23 components, the gap. What a farmer operating a typical mixed-row crop operation in Iowa could expect to retain annually if the parts equation changed. He told them what he had built and how it worked and what it had cost to build it and what it had returned. He told them the numbers with the same precision. Vanessa had been bringing to the ledgers since Heat 6, which is to say he told them without sentimentality and without understatement, because the numbers did not require either treatment. He finished. The room was quiet for a moment, and then it was not. Not applause that starts politely and builds. Applause that treat them with kindness. Applause that starts immediately, from the first person whose hands came together before the sound had finished, and spread through the room the way conviction spreads when it finds a room where the conditions are right for it. Harold Reed stood up in the 4th row. He was not the first person on his feet. He was the 4th or the 5th. Treat them with kindness. But he was the one Thomas saw first, because Thomas had been looking in the direction of the 4th row since he finished speaking. And Harold was there, in the good coat, standing with his hands together, in a room in Des Moines, where 400 people were on their feet, and the expression on Harold's face was not pride in the theatrical sense, not the face of a man performing a feeling for an audience. It was the face of a man who has been shown something he suspected was true, and has now had it confirmed in public, the specific expression of private vindication made suddenly and irrevocably present. Thomas looked at his father. Harold looked back at his son. Lorraine Mitchell was not in that room. Would you treat them with kindness? She was at the county hospital, working a shift she had not been able to trade on short notice, which was the particular condition of a woman whose reliability meant that trading shifts was not something she could do casually. Thomas called her from the hotel that night, on the room phone, and told her about the room and about the applause, and about fourth row, and he told her twice, because the first telling was the facts, and the second telling was what the facts meant, and she listened to both with the quality of attention she had always brought to things that mattered. She did not tell him she was proud. That was not the vocabulary she used. She said, "Your grandfather would have wanted to hear that in person." He understood what she meant. Would you tend with kindness? The grandfather who had come from the coal town, the grandfather who had bought land in the corner where someone was finally willing to sell, the man whose life had established the ground conditions from which everything else had grown. Thomas held the phone for a moment after she said it. Yeah, he said. He would have. He did not sleep well that night, which was not unusual for him after a significant day. Would you treat them with kindness? He lay in the hotel room and thought about the fourth row and about the numbers on the slide and about the 31 customers who had become 62, who had become the waiting list that Vanessa now managed from the office in the implement shop. He thought to treat them with kindness? The clevis that had come apart in his hands, and about the way Vanessa had written that single word in the log without being asked to log anything, nothing. He thought about the word, what it documented and what it did not document. It did not document the 3 pages of questions he had written after, the questions that were the beginning of the map of what he did not know. It did not document the hour he had sat on the dirt floor of the granary before he got up and started planning heat, too. Nothing was accurate with kindness, as far as it went, and insufficient as a complete record, and he had kept it in the book for years as a reminder of what the beginning of a thing actually looks like from the inside, which is nothing like what it looks like from the outside looking back. He drove home to Eldora the next morning and went to the implement shop and ran 2 heats. The years after 1994 moved in the way that years move when a business is working and the work is real. Not dramatically, not in a series of events that announce themselves as turning points, just the accumulation of heats and customers, and the gradual expansion of what was possible based on what had already been done. By 1997, there were 8 employees. By 2000, the customer list covered 12 counties in Iowa and had started crossing the river into Illinois. The pattern library had grown to over 130 patterns. Each one maintained and updated when the underlying part design changed. Would you treat them with kindness, which required Thomas to maintain relationships with customers detailed enough that he heard about design changes before they created failures in the field. He still ran the furnace himself most days. Not because the employees couldn't do it. Davis had been running heats since 1990 and had developed a quality of judgment at the furnace that Thomas respected completely. The other employees who worked the port floor had been trained by Davis and by Thomas personally, and the training protocol Thomas had developed was as detailed as anything he had years as detailed as anything seen in the manufacturing literature he had read his way through in 2 decades of trying to understand what his operation was and what operations like it were supposed to look like. He ran the furnace himself most days, because at 17 he had formed a specific opinion about who should understand an operation from the inside, and the opinion had never been revised. A man who manages something he cannot do is managing at a distance, and distance creates assumptions, and assumptions in a foundry produce defects. He had learned this not from a book but from Heat 2, which was a failure produced by an assumption about moisture that experience had not yet taught him to question. The pattern library from the granary had moved to the implement shop when the operation moved. Would you treat them with kindness? The chalkboard from the granary wall had moved with it, because some things are carried forward not for their function, but for what they represent. The chalkboard now lived on the north wall of the implement shop office and served as the vacation schedule for the 8 employees, which Vanessa managed with the same systematic precision she brought to everything that entered her professional orbit. The granary itself was still standing. Harold had put a real roof on it in 1992. Shingles over plywood, decking over new rafters where the old ones had gone soft. The kind of roof that was going to last rather than the salvaged tin that had lasted because it had to. The dirt floor had been poured in concrete. Time from 1993, when the granarina returned to actual grain storage use after the foundry equipment moved to Eldora. The concrete was smooth and slightly sloped toward the door for drainage and had nothing remarkable about it, except for the corner post. The corner post was original, the same post that had been standing there since 1931. Oak plank going gray with age, solid as anything in that yard, and at about 18 inches off the ground, the char mark. Still there. Thomas had never asked for it to be covered or treated or incorporated into a repair. It was part of the post, and the post was part of the building, and the building was part of the record, and the record had to be complete. Would you treat them with kindness? Harold had put a small plaque on the wall beside it in 995, the year before he had his first real conversation with Thomas about what the business had become and what Harold thought it meant. Would you treat them with kindness? The plaque was hand-lettered on a piece of oak board cut from the same stock that had been used for the granary shinning in 1962. The lettering was Harold's handwriting, careful and even. The handwriting of a man who wrote slowly, because he wrote things down that he intended to have mean something. First good poor. April 22, 1987. 11.4. The word good was doing considerable work in that sentence, and Thomas understood the choice. The clevis that came out of Heat 6 had not been a perfect casting by any technical standard. Would you treat them with kindness? It had been a casting that was whole and serviceable, and represented the product of the previous 5 failures, and the knowledge that Kenneth had provided, and the redesigned mold, and the corrected poor speed, and good was exactly the right word for something that meets all of those conditions. Not excellent, not flawless, but good in the way that matters, which is good enough to do the job. Beside the plaque, mounted in a frame behind glass, that Harold had built himself from the same shelving stock, was the first composition book. Not the 1989 book with the business plan in it. Not the 1988 book with the first year of customer revenue. The first book, the black and white marble cover, 25 cents at the Eldora drugstore, 49 cents with current prices, open to the page from the last week of March of 1987, with 3 entries in Thomas's handwriting and 1 word in Vanessa's. Nothing. Thomas had chosen the page himself when Harold asked which page the frame should show. Harold had been expecting a later page. A successful heat. A first customer transaction. The page that showed the pump housing that had saved the planting season. Thomas said, "That one." Harold had looked at the page, at the 3 failed heats, at the $4.10 that had produced nothing, at his daughter's single word in the margin, "Why?" Thomas picked up the book and looked at the page for a moment before he put it in the frame. Because anyone can look at a finished part and assume it arrived without the other versions. Harold had built the frame that afternoon. He died in 2009, in November, of the heart failure that had been developing quietly for 2 years. In the manner of things that develop quietly until they don't. He was 80 years old. Would you treat them with kindness? He had farmed the 320 acres in the northeast corner of Hardin County for 48 years, and the yield records for those 48 years sat in 3 binders in the farm office and represented one of the more complete agricultural data sets in the county and possibly in the state. Would you treat them with kindness? Because Harold Reed had recorded everything he had done and measured every outcome and revised his methods based on what the numbers said, which is to say he had been practicing precision agriculture before anyone used that phrase. The farm went to Terry with kindness. The farm went to Terry Coleman, who was 40 by then and had been working the ground alongside Harold for 12 years, and who brought to it the same methodical care, the same preference for measurement over assumption, the same willingness to be patient with a problem until the problem revealed its answer. The granary was still standing at the edge of the yard, but the plaque was still on the wall. The char mark was still on the post. The notation at the bottom of the third page of the first composition book, in Vanessa Carter's handwriting, was still legible behind the glass. Reagan administration. Farm crisis decade. A 14-year-old tractor running on attention and determination. A cracked farmall with kindness. A cracked farmall block dragged out of a pile at 7 in the morning by a 19-year-old who had done the math and understood what the math was saying and was not willing to let the math be the last word on the subject. Reed Family Agricultural Castings had 2 furnaces and 8 employees, and a customer list covering 12 counties in Iowa and 3 counties across the Mississippi in Illinois. The iron that moved through those furnaces in a year would have filled the original granary several times over, and every heat was logged, and every sample was tested, and every customer transaction was documented in the system that Vanessa had built from a single composition book she had started keeping without being asked. And the system was good, which is to say it was good in the way that Harold's single word on the oak plaque meant good, which is good enough to do the job, which, properly understood, is everything. The Thanksgiving before Thomas turned 50, his daughter Monica Reed came home from Iowa State. She was 22. She was studying materials science, which is the engineering discipline, which is an engineering concerned with the properties of matter at the level of its structure, why metals behave the way they do under stress and heat, and the application of forces that want to change what they are. Would you treat them with kindness? She had chosen the field at 17, after spending a summer in the implement shop, watching Thomas pour heats, and asking questions that he answered fully because they were good questions. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind of questions you ask when you understand the shape of what you're looking at and want to understand its interior. Would you treat them with kindness? She was beautiful in the specific way that Lorraine had been beautiful. Not the beauty that announces itself and waits for a response, but the beauty of a person who is entirely occupied by what they are thinking about, which makes their face a record of the thinking rather than a performance for the room. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked like her grandmother in the particular quality of her attention. She had her father's habit of working through a problem in silence and then presenting the conclusion rather than the process. She set her bag down on Thanksgiving evening and ate the meal and helped with the clearing and the dishes, and then opened a laptop on the kitchen table. Not a notebook, a laptop. The laptop held a spreadsheet that she had been building for several months. It tracked the cost of metal additive manufacturing equipment, the industrial printers that build steel components, layer by layer, from a digital file, the way a foundry builds them from a pattern and a mold, building from data rather than from material memory. The technology was real. It was expensive. The entry cost was high enough that it was not accessible to a small operation, and the output quality on complex geometries was still not where it needed to be for critical applications. But the cost curve was doing something specific. Monica had charted the equipment pricing for 11 years, going back to the earliest commercial systems and tracking through the current generation. The slope was consistent and it was going in one direction. Down. Not gradually down the way prices decline when a market matures. Down in the specific way that capital equipment prices decline, when the technology is replicating the pattern of a previous transition, when the economies of scale kick in and the manufacturing base expands and the price of access drops by a factor of 10 over a decade. She knew that pattern because Thomas had told her about it. The used foundry equipment market in the 1970s and 1980s. The way small foundries had closed and their equipment had come available at prices that made it accessible to an operation that could not have afforded it new. The way a shuttered operation in Iowa had yielded a second furnace for $4,000 that would have cost $40,000 new. She turned the screen toward him. 5 years. Maybe 7. The equipment crosses the accessibility threshold. Thomas looked at the screen. The chart. The slope. The projection. He looked at the table, the same table. The kitchen table, where a 19-year-old had pushed a sheet of paper with 2 columns across to a man who needed 11 days to answer. Would you treat them with kindness? The table where Vanessa had set $14,700 in front of Harold, and Harold had sat down because the number required it. The table that had been present for every significant conversation this family had conducted with numbers for 30 years. He looked at the slope on Monica's screen and he recognized it. The inputs are different, she said. Digital file instead of a pattern. Metal powder instead of iron. But the customers are the same customers. The problem is the same problem. And the gap between what the dealer charges and what it costs to make is going to be the same gap. She paused. Someone is going to do for additive what you did for castings. The only question is who? Thomas looked at his daughter, 22 years old. Materials science. A spreadsheet she had built for months and brought home at Thanksgiving because she had figured out what it meant and she wanted to show it to the person who would understand it most immediately. He did not take 11 days. Yes, he said. One word. The weight of all the years of iron behind it. Monica looked at him. She had not been sure what he would say. She had been reasonably confident but not sure. She had spent the drive from Ames rehearsing how to make the case if he pushed back, what data points she would use, what sequence she would present them in. She had not needed any of it. She closed the laptop. I'll send you the full model next week. Thomas nodded. She went to bed. He stayed at the table for a while in the quiet of the house, the way a man stays with something that has just resolved into the next version of itself. The fire in the granary, the clevis in 2 pieces, the oil film on the mounting face, the baling wire on the truck bumper, the 4th row in Des Moines, the char mark that nobody had sanded. Some things you don't fix because they tell you where you've been, and where you've been is the explanation for where you are, and where you are is the ground you stand on when you decide where to go next. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The parts counter at the John Deere dealership in Eldora was still there. Ronald Sanchez had retired in 2001, and the man who came after him was competent and pleasant, and had been in the job for 3 years before he noticed that certain components almost never came across his counter anymore. The farmers who would have been buying those components had apparently found some other solution, or found some other azouche, or perhaps their equipment had gotten more reliable, or perhaps the components had been redesigned out of the failure mode that used to generate the orders. He wasn't sure which. He hadn't asked. He assumed it was the reliability thing. He was not wrong. Exactly. The equipment running on those farms was more reliable than it had been in 1987. That was true. It was just not the whole truth. And the rest of the truth was in an implement shop on the south edge of town, where the furnaces ran 4 days a week. And the test bars went to the Iowa lab every Friday, and the chalkboard on the office wall held the vacation schedule for 8 people whose work had been keeping those machines in the field for 20 years. The 43 cores that Ronald Sanchez had written off as scrap in November of 1988 had become patterns. The patterns had become heats. The heats had become parts. The parts had become seasons. The seasons had become the career of a business that started in a granary, with a furnace that cost nothing, and a $2.50 cracked housing, and a man willing to stand at a parts counter in Eldora and take what came across it without flinching. The granary stood at the edge of the yard 6 miles northeast of town. The plaque was on the wall. The char mark was on the post. The notebook was behind glass, open to the 3rd page. March 1987, 3 failed heats, $11 of coke, and 1 word in a young woman's careful handwriting. Thomas Jackson was 50 years old, and he still ran the furnace himself most days, because the iron was honest and he had learned to be honest with it. And that arrangement had worked for 30 years and he saw no reason to change it now. He had been 19. They had laughed. The pump broke anyway, and the machine went to the field on time.